Hello, and thank you for being here, for choosing to spend this time, this hour, this space between waking and sleeping with me and with this story. For the next 2 hours, I'm going to tell you a story, not to entertain you, though I hope it does, not to inform you, though you might learn something, but to be with you, to hold space for whatever you're carrying as you try to rest, as you try to let go of the day that's behind you and the day that's coming tomorrow. This is a story about work that disappeared, about a woman who became obsolete, about what it means to matter in a world that keeps moving forward, keeps changing, keeps replacing what came before with what comes next. You don't need to stay awake for all of it. In fact, I hope you don't. I hope you let the story carry you under whenever you're ready, whenever your body decides it's time to rest, because I'll still be here, still speaking into the dark, still telling this story even after you've let go, even after you've drifted away, even after sleep has claimed you. So get comfortable now, adjust your pillow, pull your blanket a little closer, let your breath slow down, let your shoulders drop, let your jaw relax, and let me tell you about Margaret Chen, the switchboard operator, the woman who connected voices, who built bridges made of wire and care, who spent 32 years being necessary in ways no one ever saw. Margaret's hands moved before her mind did. They always had, always moved first with a kind of knowledge that lived in muscle and bone and fingertip. Cable to jack, circuit complete. Voices flowing like water finding its path the way water always finds its path. Inevitable and necessary. And so constant it becomes invisible the way all essential things become invisible. For 32 years, her hands had been the bridge. 32 years of cable to jack and circuit complete. 32 years of voices needing to reach across distance. And Margaret being the one who made that reaching possible, who turned separation into connection, isolation into conversation, silence into sound. But here's what no one understood about switchboard work, what Margaret herself hadn't understood until maybe year 15, when the pattern had become so deep it felt like breathing, as automatic as breathing, as essential and unconscious as breathing. She wasn't connecting calls. She was connecting need. Human need. The need to hear another voice. The need to know you're not alone in the dark. The need to reach across miles and say, I'm here. Are you there? Can you hear me? Do I still exist if no one hears my voice? That's what she connected. Not calls. Need. At 3 in the morning, when a man's voice broke asking for St. Mary's Hospital, Margaret didn't just plug in a cable, didn't just complete a circuit, didn't just do the mechanical work of connection. She heard the terror underneath the words, heard what he wasn't saying, heard the fear that makes voices shake and breath come fast, and words stumble over themselves. She made her voice softer then, softer and steadier. The kind of voice that says, "I'm here, I'm present, I'm holding this moment with you. I'm connecting you now, sir," she said. "Hold the line." And those words, "hold the line," they weren't just instruction. They were permission to fall apart, because someone was holding the line. Someone was maintaining the connection. Someone was making sure he wouldn't be alone in his terror. The hospital would save his wife or wouldn't. Medicine would work or wouldn't. Fate would be kind or cruel. But in that 3-second interval of connection, in those 3 seconds, while Margaret completed the circuit, and the phone rang in the hospital and someone answered, Margaret held his hope together, held him together, was the container for everything he was feeling, everything he feared, everything he needed in that moment. The new machines, the automated systems, the technology that was coming to replace her, they'd connect faster, more efficiently, with greater reliability and consistency and speed. But they couldn't hold anything. They couldn't hold fear or hope or need, or the desperate reaching of a man who needs to know if his wife is still alive. They could only connect circuits. Margaret connected humans. There was a woman. Margaret never learned her name, never asked, never was told, who called the operator every Tuesday at 2:15 in the afternoon for 7 years. 7 years of Tuesdays. 7 years of 2:15. 7 years of the same request, in the same voice, with the same careful politeness. "I'd like to place a call to my sister in Milwaukee, please." Always the same. Tuesday, 2:15. Milwaukee. The words like a ritual, like a prayer, like something that had to be said exactly that way, or the magic wouldn't work. The 3rd year, maybe the 3rd year, or maybe the 4th. Time blurs when you do the same thing over and over. Margaret realized something about this woman. Realized it not from anything she said, but from what she didn't say, from the quality of her voice, from the time of day, from the pattern of it. The woman's husband was a long-haul trucker, gone Tuesday nights. Overnight routes that meant the woman was alone in her house. And Tuesday afternoons, 2:15 exactly, or when the loneliness became unbearable, became too much to hold alone, became a weight that needed to be shared, even if just for a few minutes, even if just through a phone line, even if just with her sister in Milwaukee, who maybe had something to say, or maybe didn't, but at least would answer, at least would be there, at least would confirm through her voice that the woman still existed, still mattered, still had a sister who would take her calls. She didn't always have something to say to her sister. The Tuesday woman didn't always have news or updates or reasons to call. She just needed to hear another human voice confirm she existed, needed to speak and be heard, needed to break the silence of her empty house on Tuesday afternoons, when when the loneliness pressed down like weather, like a storm she had to endure, like something she could survive if only she could hear another voice, any voice, a voice that knew her name. Margaret never told her she knew, never acknowledged the pattern, never said anything that would break the fragile dignity of the woman's careful request, because that would have broken something, would have exposed something that needed to stay hidden, would have made visible what the woman needed to keep invisible. Instead, Margaret made sure to say every Tuesday, every single Tuesday at 2:15 for 7 years, "Of course, let me connect you right away," making the woman feel like her need mattered, like her request was important, like Margaret was pleased to help her, like there was nothing sad or desperate or lonely about calling your sister at exactly 2:15 every Tuesday for 7 years. Because there wasn't. There was just need. Human need. The need that everyone has to not be alone, to hear a voice, to matter to someone. And Margaret honored that need by treating it as ordinary, as normal, as the most natural thing in the world. The automated system wouldn't know it was Tuesday, wouldn't recognize the particular quality of loneliness that sounds like routine, sounds like ritual, sounds like someone trying very hard to make their desperation look like habit. The automated system would just connect the call efficiently and quickly, without understanding that some calls aren't about information. They're about connection, about presence, about someone on the other end of the line who hears not just your words, but what's underneath your words, who holds your loneliness without numbing it, who treats your need with the same care they treat anyone's need, because all need is sacred. All reaching toward connection is worthy of respect. All attempts to not be alone deserve to be met with gentle attention. This is what Margaret understood deep in her bones, in the architecture of her muscle memory, in the places where knowledge lives below thought. She understood that connection wasn't about efficiency, wasn't about speed, wasn't about getting from point A to point B as quickly as possible. Connection was about witness, being witnessed, having someone hear you, really hear you, not just the words, but the person speaking the words, the need behind the request, the human underneath the transaction. She had witnessed thousands of moments no one else would ever see, moments that happened in the space between asking for connection and receiving it, moments that lasted seconds, but contained entire lifetimes of need and hope and fear and love. The trembling voice asking for the cancer ward, voice trying so hard to stay steady, to sound normal, to not break down before even getting connected. And Margaret hearing all of that and making her voice steady so the caller could borrow her steadiness, could use her calm like a rope to hold onto. The teenage girl gathering courage to call a boy, practicing her opening line while Margaret waited patiently, not rushing her, not asking her to hurry up, just being present while the girl found her courage. And then connecting the call with a gentle go ahead that felt like encouragement, like someone believing in her. The man who called the weather line just to hear a voice, any voice, during his lunch break because he worked alone. And sometimes the silence of his job felt like drowning. And even a recorded voice telling him the temperature and forecast was better than no voice at all. And Margaret knowing this, knowing why he called, and always being extra warm when she connected him, giving him a few seconds of real human contact before passing him to the recording. Margaret was the invisible witness to an entire city's vulnerability, to all the ways people reached for connection, to all the moments when someone needed to hear another voice or be heard by another voice, or just know that someone else existed in the darkness with them. And she held it carefully, held every voice, held every need, held every Tuesday at 2:15, held it all with the same steady attention, the same gentle care, the same recognition that this mattered, that these moments of connection mattered even though no one would remember them, even though they left no trace, even though they disappeared the moment they ended. She held it all, kept nothing. That was the work. But there were other calls too, darker ones, harder ones, calls that she carried for days or weeks or months afterward, calls that lived in her body like stones, like weight, like something she couldn't put down no matter how much she wanted to. The mother at 4 a.m, voice flat with shock, beyond tears, in that place where emotion becomes absence. My son isn't breathing. And Margaret connecting her to emergency services in 8 seconds. 8 seconds. That was her personal best. Her fastest emergency connection ever. And she'd never told anyone about that record, never mentioned it, never took pride in it, because it felt wrong to take pride in someone else's worst moment. Wrong to make that about her competence when it was about a mother's terror, a child's life, a moment that would divide that woman's life into before and after. She remembered that call for months afterward, months of wondering if the child lived, if 8 seconds had been fast enough, if 1 second slower would have meant the difference, if the mother blamed the brief interval of connection for whatever happened next. She carried that voice, that flat shock, that my son isn't breathing in a place beneath her ribs, carried it the way you carry all the things you can't change, all the suffering you witness but can't prevent, all the moments when your best isn't enough to save anyone from what's happening to them. Margaret carried fragments of everyone's crisis this way, collected them like stones, like weight, like a burden she could never put down, because There was nowhere to put it, no one to give it to, no ritual for releasing what she'd witnessed. This was the hidden cost of her work, the price no one saw, the weight that came with being the witness, being the voice in the dark, being the connection point for all these human moments of need and crisis and fear and desperate reaching. She carried fragments, and she had nowhere to put them down. At home, her husband would ask, "How was work?" Simple question, ordinary question, the kind of question people ask each other every day. And Margaret would say, "Fine, busy," because how could she explain? How could she possibly put into words what she'd heard and held and witnessed? How could she say, "I connected a woman to her dying mother today. I heard her say goodbye through the line. I was there for it. I'm the only other person in the world who heard that goodbye. And now I can't unknow it, can't unhear it, can't stop carrying it." So she said, "Fine, busy," and carried it alone, carried all of it alone, carried 32 years of other people's need and crisis and fear and love and goodbye, and I'm here. And are you there? And please help me, and I don't know what to do. She carried it because that was the work, because being the witness meant holding what you witnessed, because connection has a cost, and the cost is that you feel the weight of what you're connecting. You hold the need you're meeting. You carry the crisis you're helping with. The automated systems wouldn't carry anything. They just connect circuits efficiently and quickly and move on to the next call without holding any of it, without being changed by any of it, without collecting stones in the place beneath their ribs where Margaret kept all the voices she'd never forget. Margaret came to the switchboard at 22 years old, 22, and full of different dreams, 22, and imagining a different future, 22, and not yet understanding that the future you imagine and the future you live are almost never the same future. And the work of being human is learning to make peace with that difference, learning to find meaning in the life you actually have instead of mourning the life you thought you'd have. Before that, before the switchboard, before 32 years of cable to jack and circuit complete, she'd wanted to be a translator, had imagined herself at the United Nations with her voice carrying between worlds, building bridges between countries and cultures and languages, making understanding possible where language created walls. Her mother had taught her Cantonese, English, and enough Spanish to dream in all three languages, to think in multiple ways of organizing the world, to understand that translation isn't just about words, but about worldviews, about the different ways humans make meaning, and try to communicate that meaning to each other across the distances that separate us. She'd imagined herself at the United Nations, young and idealistic Margaret with her three languages, and her belief that communication could solve anything. that if people could just understand each other, they'd stop hurting each other, stop going to war, stop building walls between themselves and everyone who seemed different. She'd imagined her voice negotiating peace, her languages building bridges, her translations making possible the understanding that would change the world. Big dreams, important dreams, the kind of dreams 22-year-olds have before the world teaches them that most dreams get translated to, get changed in the crossing from imagination to reality, get transformed into something smaller, but maybe not less meaningful. Instead, she carried voices between Minneapolis and Milwaukee, between downtown and suburbs, between the living and the dying, between people who needed connection and people who could provide it. Smaller than she'd imagined, much smaller. A switchboard in a local telephone office instead of the United Nations. Local calls instead of international diplomacy. Working class people trying to reach their families instead of world leaders trying to prevent wars. Smaller, so much smaller. But was it really? Was it actually smaller? Or just different? Just another way of doing the same work of connection. Just another form of translation. Just another way of building bridges between people who needed to reach each other across distance. There was a night, 1956 maybe, or 57. Time runs together after enough years. There was a night when a doctor was trying to reach another doctor about a child's rapidly escalating fever, medical jargon that Margaret didn't fully understand. Terms she'd never heard before. Urgency in his voice that needed no translation. Desperation that speaks the same language everywhere. The first doctor's English was shaky, heavily accented, words coming out in the wrong order, syntax that made sense in his first language but confused English speakers, and the receiving hospital kept asking him to repeat himself. "I'm sorry, could you say that again?" With frustration building on both ends, frustration and fear, and a child somewhere getting sicker. While these two doctors tried to understand each other across the barrier of language, Margaret could hear the gap growing between them, could hear the space where understanding should be, but wasn't, could hear the child's life suspended in mistranslation, in the failure of words to cross from one mind to another, in the breakdown of communication that happens when people don't share the same way of organizing language, the same patterns of speaking, the same assumptions about how words work. The first doctor was getting more upset, his English deteriorating as his fear increased, and the receiving hospital was getting more frustrated, their patience wearing thin, and Margaret could hear it all falling apart, could hear the connection she'd made failing to actually connect anything, could hear communication becoming its opposite. So Margaret did something she wasn't supposed to do, something that broke protocol, something that could have gotten her reprimanded or written up or even fired. if her supervisor had been listening. She stepped into the line, not as the operator, but as a person, as someone who could help, as someone who had 3 languages and could hear what was getting lost in translation and could build a bridge across that gap. "Doctor," she said, gentle but clear, "may I help clarify?" And then she translated, not word for word, but meaning for meaning, taking what the first doctor was trying to say in his uncertain English and putting it into clear medical terms the hospital would understand, taking the hospital's questions and putting them in simpler English the first doctor could follow, building a bridge between them made of her voice and her languages and her willingness to break protocol. Because a child's life mattered more than rules about operators not speaking on the line. She translated the technical terms, bridged the linguistic gap, smoothed the communication until the doctors understood each other perfectly, until they could work together instead of talking past each other, until the medical information could flow the way it needed to flow. The right medication, the right dosage, the right treatment. The child got what they needed, probably lived. Margaret never knew for certain, never followed up, never found out if her intervention had saved a life, or if the child would have been fine anyway, or if nothing she did made any difference at all. She never knew, but she'd used all 3 of her languages that night, had been the bridge she'd always wanted to be, had done the work of translation she'd dreamed of doing, just not at the United Nations, not in service of peace treaties or diplomatic negotiations, but in service of one scared doctor trying to help one sick child in the middle of the night. She'd been a translator, after all, just not the kind that gets remembered, just not the kind that anyone writes down in history books or gives awards to or recognizes as important. The invisible kind, the kind that happens in darkness and leaves no trace and disappears the moment it's done. Some nights, many nights, most nights when the board was quiet, when the calls slowed down, and there was time to think, time to sit with her own thoughts, instead of just reacting to everyone else's needs. Margaret wondered if disappointment was just a failure of translation, if the gap between what she'd hoped for and what she'd gotten was actually smaller than it seemed, if maybe she just hadn't found the right words yet to translate her dream into her reality, to see how they connected, how they were versions of the same thing. She'd translated her dream into something possible, something real, something that fit into her actual life instead of the imagined life she'd had at 22. She'd made her dream smaller so it could be real. And that translation, that transformation from imagined to actual, it felt like both achievement and loss, like success and failure at the same time, like she'd gotten what she wanted and lost what she wanted in the same moment. It still felt like loss, even as she recognized it was also achievement. It it still felt like loss, like something had been taken from her, like she'd been cheated out of the bigger life she was supposed to have. Both things were true: achievement and loss, success and failure, the life she'd built and the life she'd dreamed of, both true at the same time, existing together, impossible to separate into one or the other, into good or bad, into right or wrong. Just true, both true. The way most things in life are both true, are complicated, are impossible to reduce to simple categories of success or failure, satisfaction or disappointment. Both, always both. She'd read once, in a magazine in a doctor's waiting room, that atoms in our body completely replace themselves every 7 years, that you're literally a different person every 7 years. New cells, new matter, same consciousness moving through forms, same sense of being yourself, even though physically you're someone new, someone different, someone who shares a memory with your previous self, but not a single atom, not a single molecule of matter. And Margaret thought about that, thought about it often, thought about how she'd been at this job for 32 years now, how that was more than 4 complete cycles of becoming a new person, how the Margaret who'd started at 22 and the Margaret sitting at the switchboard now at 54 were connected by memory and consciousness, but were physically entirely different people, separated by time and experience, and all the atoms that had been replaced in between. She'd been 5 different people since starting this job. 5 different Margarets. 5 different versions of the same consciousness moving through different forms, different understandings, different relationships to the work and to herself, and to the question of whether this was enough, whether this life was enough, whether she was enough. The eager 22-year-old Margaret who believed competence would be recognized, who thought if she just worked hard enough and did well enough, someone would notice. Someone would see her talent and promote her, or give her more important work, or at least acknowledge that she was good at this, that she mattered. That Margaret lasted about 3 years before the world taught her that competence in invisible work stays invisible, that being good at something one notices doesn't make anyone notice you, that women's work is undervalued precisely because women do it, regardless of how well they do it. The 30-year-old Margaret who stopped expecting recognition, who made peace with invisibility, who decided that doing good work was enough even if no one saw it, who found a kind of quiet dignity in being excellent at something thankless, in being the infrastructure no one appreciated, because infrastructure only gets noticed when it fails. That Margaret lasted about 8 years, carried her through her 30s, gave her a framework for understanding her work as meaningful, even if others didn't see the meaning, even if the world treated her as replaceable, as unskilled, as someone whose job could be done by anyone. The 38-year-old Margaret, who found strange satisfaction in invisible mastery, who started to actually love the work, not for how it looked to others, but for how it felt to her, for the way her hands knew exactly what to do, for the calm competence of being so good at something it became automatic, became like breathing, became a place where she could rest even while working, because the work required no conscious thought, just presence, just showing up, just letting her hands do what they knew how to do. That Margaret lasted almost 10 years, was maybe the happiest Margaret, the one most at peace with the life she actually had instead of the life she'd imagined. 47-year-old Margaret, who occasionally resented every ungrateful voice, who had days when the invisibility felt like erasure, when the lack of appreciation felt like evidence that nothing she did mattered, when she looked at her life and saw waste, saw years spent on work that would be forgotten the moment she stopped doing it, saw herself becoming obsolete even before the technology came to replace her. Just by aging, just by being a woman in her late 40s doing work that no one valued. That Margaret was hard, bitter sometimes, tired always, resentful of every caller who treated her like a machine, like a function, like something that existed only to serve them without needing anything herself. And now at 54, the current Margaret, the Margaret who understood, finally understood, maybe too late, but at least eventually, that the work wasn't about her at all, that she'd spent years making it about her, about whether she was valued or recognized or appreciated, when actually the work was just the work, was just connection, was just being there when people needed someone to be there. And whether anyone recognized that, or valued that, or appreciated that didn't change whether it mattered, didn't change whether it was real, didn't change whether the connections she made were actual connections that actually helped actual people in actual moments of actual need. The work mattered because the need was real, not because anyone said thank you. This Margaret, the 54-year-old Margaret, understood that finally. That was both the liberation and the heartbreak. Liberation from needing recognition. Heartbreak from all the years she'd wasted needing it. The memo came on a Thursday. Just a Thursday, ordinary Thursday. Nothing to mark it as the day when everything changed, when the future arrived and made it clear there was no more pretending, no more avoiding. The memo came on a Thursday, and the world divided into before the memo, and after the memo, before knowing, and after knowing, before the end was real, and after it became inevitable. Not even a meeting. That's what struck Margaret. Not even the courtesy of gathering them together and telling them in person. Just a memo, just words on paper, just impersonal corporate language, just efficiency even in ending, which seemed appropriate somehow, seemed like the perfect symbol of everything that was happening, that they were being replaced by efficiency, and the replacement itself was being done efficiently. The memo said, effective June 1st, 1972, all switchboard operations will transition to automated systems. Will transition like it was just a change, just progress, not an ending, not the elimination of an entire category of human work. Operators will be offered severance packages or reassignment to available positions in data entry. Data entry, from connecting humans to entering numbers into machines that didn't care, couldn't care, were incapable of caring, because machines don't care. Machines just function. Machines just do what they're programmed to do without caring about what they're doing or why. Data entry. The same hands that had connected lovers and doctors and mothers and children, the same hands that had held crisis and need and fear and hope, those hands would now enter numbers, would press keys, would do work that required no witness, no presence, no care, no attention to what was underneath the information. Just data, just entry, just mechanical work measured by speed and accuracy, and nothing else. No room for the translation work, the emotional work, the work of being present for people's vulnerable moments. Margaret read it 3 times, looking for something, maybe hope, maybe a way out, maybe a suggestion this wasn't final, wasn't inevitable. But no, the words were clear, unambiguous, absolute, effective June 1st. That was less than 2 months away. Less than 2 months before 32 years became past tense, became something she used to do instead of something she did. 3 times she read it, hoping the words would change. But no, the words stayed the same, meant the same thing, said the same ending. Then she folded it precisely in half. The way she folded everything, with care, with attention, with the precision that had characterized 32 years of work, folded it and placed it in her purse. That movement so ordinary, placing something in her purse. Nothing remarkable except what she was putting in her purse, was the end of her working life, the end of her identity as someone useful, the end of the version of herself who knew what she was for. She went back to the board. What else was there to do? The work wasn't over yet, not for another 2 months. And until then, people still needed connections, still needed her hands and her voice and her presence. A man needed the police, emergency, break-in, fear in his voice, and she connected him, her hands steady, her voice calm. A woman needed her mother, long distance, voice tired and lonely, and Margaret connected her, her voice warm, her hands sure. A child had somehow gotten the operator line and was crying, small voice, scared voice, and Margaret broke. Protocol the way she sometimes did when protocol mattered less than people. Stayed on the line, kept saying gentle things. "It's okay, sweetheart, you're okay. Can you tell me your address? Let's find a grown-up for you," kept saying gentle things until an adult's voice appeared, relief, safety, and then Margaret disconnected and felt something crack inside her chest. Not dramatic, not cinematic, not like the movies, just a small structural failure in the place where she'd stored her sense of being necessary. A small crack in the internal architecture that had held her together, held her sense of self, held her understanding of who she was and what she mattered for. Just a crack, just a small failure, just the beginning of something falling apart that wouldn't stop falling apart until there was nothing left to fall. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep, lay in bed next to her husband, listening to his breathing, steady and reliable, and unburdened by the knowledge that his wife's work was ending. His wife's identity was cracking. His wife's sense of purpose was being eliminated by machines. His breathing stayed steady because this wasn't happening to him. His work was secure. His hands would still have work tomorrow, and next week, and next month. His identity wasn't tied to a profession that was disappearing. His life was going on exactly as it had been while hers was ending. She listened to his breathing and thought about how you can be lying next to someone and still be completely alone. How proximity doesn't mean understanding. How marriage doesn't mean your spouse can feel what you're feeling. She was alone with this ending, alone with the crack in her chest, alone with the question that kept circling through her mind. How do you grieve something that hasn't ended yet? Because that's what this was. Grief. Not for the job itself, though that was part of it, but grief for something bigger. Grief for the version of herself who had a place in the world, who was needed, who mattered in a measurable daily way, who woke up knowing what she was for. She'd be 54 when the switchboard closed, 54 when she became obsolete, when her skills became irrelevant, when her experience became nothing more than nostalgia. Still young enough to start over, people would say. People who meant well. People who didn't understand that starting over at 54 isn't the same as starting at 22. That learning new skills when you're older requires you to unmake yourself before you can remake yourself. Requires you to let go of everything you know and become a beginner again in a world that doesn't value beginners. But Margaret knew deep in her bones. She knew she wouldn't start over, wouldn't reinvent herself, wouldn't learn data entry or find some new career. She'd just stop, just end, just become one of those women you see sometimes, women of a certain age with no clear purpose, women who used to be something but aren't anymore, women who fill their days with errands and television and waiting for grandchildren to visit, women whose lives are behind them instead of ahead of them. This work had been her life for 32 years, longer than her marriage, longer than her children had lived at home, longer than any other relationship she'd ever had, the longest relationship of her life, the most consistent thing about her existence, the thing she could count on when everything else changed, when children grew up and moved away, when friends drifted, when her body aged, when the world transformed around her. The work stayed the same, stayed reliable, stayed there every morning waiting for her hands. And it was ending, not because she'd failed, not because she wasn't good enough or fast enough, but because the world had decided it no longer needed what she offered, had decided that human witness wasn't worth the cost, that presence could be replaced by automation, that care mattered less than efficiency, that the work she dedicated 32 years to perfecting could be done better, faster, cheaper by machines that didn't need anything, didn't feel anything, didn't witness anything, just functioned, just connected circuits. The first week after the memo, Margaret worked exactly as she always had, perfect performance. Every call handled with precision, every voice met with presence. Maybe that would matter. Maybe excellence could save her. Maybe if she was perfect enough, indispensable enough, they'd realize they couldn't replace her, that automation couldn't do what she did. Maybe excellence could save her. It couldn't. Excellence never could save anyone from obsolescence, because obsolescence isn't about excellence, isn't about competence, isn't about how good you are at the work. Obsolescence is about economics, about efficiency, about whether what you offer can be obtained more cheaply some other way. And it always can. There's always a cheaper way, always a machine that doesn't need brakes or benefits or the recognition that comes with being human. Excellence can't compete with that. Presence can't compete with that. Care can't compete with that. The second week, she started noticing things she'd stopped seeing years ago. Details that had become so familiar, they'd become invisible the way all familiar things become invisible. She started seeing the switchboard again, really seeing it. The way the light hit the cables at 4 in the afternoon, golden light, dusty light, beautiful in a way she'd never registered before. The specific creak of her chair when she leaned forward, a sound she'd heard 10,000 times, 100,000 times, a sound so familiar it had become silence. And now suddenly she heard it again, that creak, that particular sound that only her chair made, the smell of the machinery, hot metal and electricity, and something else she couldn't name, something that smelled like possibility, like connection, like the moment before communication happens, that smell that had been the background scent of her working life for 3 decades. She breathed it in deliberately now, consciously, trying to memorize it, trying to store it somewhere she could access later when this was all gone. She was memorizing. That's what this was. She was preparing for the haunting of her own life, preparing for the way this place would live in her memory, would show up in dreams, would become the landscape of nostalgia and loss, and the peculiar grief we feel for work that mattered to us, even if it didn't matter to anyone else, even if the world saw it as replaceable, as unskilled, as something any machine could do. The third week she began arriving 15 minutes early, not because she needed to, not because anyone asked her to, but because each extra minute was a minute the future hadn't claimed yet, was a minute that still belonged to the present, still belonged to the version of her life where she was a switchboard operator. 15 minutes of borrowed time, stolen time, time she claimed back from the ending. She'd sit at the dark board before turning it on, sit in the silence before the hum began, and she'd try to feel grateful, try to access some sense of completion or satisfaction about what was ending. Sometimes she could. Sometimes sitting there in the dark, she could feel a kind of peace, a kind of acceptance, a recognition that all things end. And this ending was just one more ending in a world full of endings. But mostly, she just felt sad, just felt the crack in her chest widening, just felt the architecture of her sense of self continuing to crumble under the weight of knowing this was ending, knowing she was being replaced, knowing that in a few weeks none of this would be hers anymore. The fourth week anger arrived, not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, slowly, building like water behind a dam. Not the hot kind of anger, not rage, the cold kind, the quiet kind, the kind that sits in your chest like ice and asks questions you can't answer and makes you look at your life and see waste, see injustice, see all the ways you've been used and undervalued and treated as disposable. The kind of anger that asks, why did I give so much to something that gives nothing back? Why did I dedicate 32 years to work that can be eliminated with a memo? Why did I think loyalty mattered, dedication mattered, excellence mattered, when the only thing that actually matters is cost, is efficiency, is whether there's a cheaper way to do what I do? But that wasn't quite right either, wasn't quite true, wasn't quite fair to the work or to herself. The work had given her something, had given her more than nothing, had given her purpose and structure and a place in the world, had given her a shape for her days, and a reason to get up in the morning, and a sense of being useful, of mattering. A community of voices that didn't know they were a community, held together by her invisible architecture, connected by her hands, witnessed by her presence. And now that self was being archived, that identity was being eliminated, that understanding of who she was being erased by progress, by efficiency, by the world's decision that human witness costs more than it's worth. That presence can be replaced by automation. That care is less important than speed. The work had given her a self, and now the work was taking that self away, and she didn't know who she'd be without it, didn't know what shape her days would take, didn't know what she was for anymore, didn't know how to understand herself as someone who wasn't a switchboard operator, because for 32 years, that's what she'd been. That's how she defined herself. That's the answer she gave when people asked what she did, who she was, what her life was about. Three weeks before the end, 3 weeks before June 1st, 3 weeks before 32 years became past tense, Margaret did something she'd never done in all her time at the switchboard, something that felt both necessary and futile, both meaningful and pointless, something she couldn't quite explain to herself, but knew she needed to do anyway. She started keeping a list, not of calls, not of numbers, not of statistics or metrics, or any of the things the company kept track of, but of moments, of the things that mattered, of the human connections that wouldn't show up in any official record, but were the actual work, the real work, the work underneath the work, not of calls, of moments. Moments when something true happened, when connection meant something, when her presence made a difference, when being human instead of being a machine actually mattered in ways she could point to, could name, could write down and say, see, this is what machines can't do. This is what automation eliminates. This is what we lose when we choose efficiency over presence. May 8th, 10:43 in the morning, she wrote, connected a man to his daughter's college dormitory. Routine call. Nothing special about it. Just a father wanting to talk to his daughter. But then she heard him say it. Heard him say, I'm proud of you, in a voice that suggested he'd been trying to say it for years, trying to find the right moment, trying to gather the courage. And this phone call, this ordinary Tuesday morning phone call, was finally the moment he could say it, could let those words out, could tell his daughter something he'd been holding inside for too long. And Margaret was there for it, witnessed it, was the third person present for that moment, even though neither the father nor the daughter knew she was there, knew she was listening, knew she was holding space for this tender thing passing between them. She wrote down the time, the feeling in the air, the way the man's voice had cracked just slightly when he said proud, the way that crack contained years of wanting to say this, years of love that hadn't found words yet, years of a father trying to connect with a daughter across the strange distance that sometimes exists between parents and children, even when they love each other, especially when they love each other. She wrote it down not because anyone would ever read it, not because it would change anything, not because it would save her job or prove her value or make the machines less efficient, but because someone needed to remember Someone needed to witness the witness. Someone needed to say this happened, this mattered, this was real. May 10th, 3:17 in the afternoon. Woman called asking for anyone. I just need to hear a voice. That's what she said, not a number, not a person, not a specific destination. Just anyone, just a voice, just proof that someone else existed in the world with her. And Margaret understood what she was hearing. Understood that this woman was alone in a way that was unbearable. Alone in a way that made staying on the phone with the operator feel like salvation, like rescue, like the only thing standing between her and complete isolation. So Margaret stayed on the line even though she wasn't supposed to, even though there were other calls waiting, even though protocol said operators don't stay on the line. Operators just connect. Operators don't provide company or comfort or presence beyond the mechanical function of their job. But Margaret stayed on the line with this woman who needed to hear a voice. And they didn't talk, didn't have a conversation, didn't exchange information or pleasantries, or anything that would look like communication from the outside. They just breathed together for 45 seconds, just existed on the same line together, just shared a moment of connection that was pure and simple, and exactly what the woman had asked for. Someone, anyone, a voice, a presence, proof that she wasn't completely alone in the universe. 45 seconds of breathing together. Margaret counted. 45 seconds that probably saved that woman from something, from despair or panic, or the kind of loneliness that becomes dangerous, becomes destructive, becomes more than just feeling alone, but feeling like you're the only real person in a world of ghosts. And then the woman said thank you in a voice that was steadier than it had been, a voice that had found ground again, found something to stand on. And Margaret disconnected, went to the next call, went back to her work. But she carried that 45 seconds with her, carried the knowledge that she'd been there for someone who needed someone to be there, that her presence had mattered in a way that couldn't be measured or quantified or put in a performance review, but was absolutely real, absolutely necessary, absolutely the difference between one kind of afternoon and another kind of afternoon. For a woman whose name Margaret would never know. May 15th, 11:22 at night. Late shift, emergency call, house fire, and Margaret connected them to the fire department in 11 seconds. 11 seconds from the panicked voice saying fire to the fire department dispatcher saying, "We're on our way." 11 seconds that was her personal record, her fastest emergency connection ever. 11 seconds of pure efficiency, pure training, pure muscle memory, doing exactly what it was trained to do without hesitation, without error, without any wasted motion or wasted time. She wrote it down, my personal record. But then she crossed that out, felt wrong, felt like making it about her when it was about someone's house burning, someone's life in danger, someone's crisis that she'd helped with by being fast, by being good at her job, by having practiced this specific type of connection so many times that she could do it perfectly under pressure, could do it in 11 seconds flat. She crossed out personal record and wrote instead, hope it mattered. Hope those 11 seconds made a difference. Hope being fast enough meant someone got saved, something got rescued, some disaster got prevented or mitigated or made less awful by the speed of that connection. She'd never know if it did. Never know if 11 seconds versus 12 seconds versus 15 seconds made any actual difference in outcomes. Never know if the fire department got there in time or too late. Never know if anyone was hurt or if everyone got out safely. Never know if her 11 seconds mattered at all, or if it would have been exactly the same at 12 seconds, at 15 seconds, at 20 seconds. But she'd been as fast as humanly possible, and that would have to be enough. That would have to count for something. That would have to mean that she'd done everything she could do. Everything she was trained to do. Everything that 32 years of practice had prepared her to do in that moment. May 19th, 7:03 in the morning, early shift, and the regular Tuesday woman called for her sister in Milwaukee. The woman who'd been calling every Tuesday at 2:15 for 7 years. Except this was morning. 7 in the morning, instead of 2 in the afternoon, different time, wrong time. And Margaret almost said something, almost asked if everything was okay, because the pattern breaking felt ominous, felt like something was wrong. But she didn't. She just made her voice extra warm and said, "Good morning. It's lovely to hear your voice today." Something she'd never said before, never added the personal touch, never acknowledged the woman as more than just a customer requesting a connection. But something made her say it, some instinct, some sense that this moment needed more than just mechanical efficiency. And the woman paused, actually paused, was silent for a moment, and then said, "Thank you, you two," said it in a voice that was surprised, a voice that had just realized someone saw her, someone heard her, someone recognized her not just as a request, but as a person, as a voice, as someone who mattered. "Thank you, you two." First time in 7 years, she'd acknowledged that Margaret was a person. First time she'd responded to Margaret as anything other than a function, a machine, a utility that connected calls. First time she'd seen the witness, and Margaret connected her to Milwaukee with hands that were shaking just slightly. Connected her, and then sat back and cried, just for a moment, just a few tears. Cried not from sadness exactly, but from the sudden recognition of how invisible she'd been, how thoroughly invisible, how completely erased by her own competence at being seamless, at being there without being noticed, at at being the infrastructure that only gets seen when it breaks. 7 years of connection. 7 years of holding this woman's Tuesday loneliness, of being there every week, of providing the bridge this woman needed between her isolated life and her sister's voice. 7 years of service and care and reliable presence. And only now, at the end, almost at the very end, did the woman see her, acknowledge her, respond to her as a human being instead of as a mechanism. It should have felt validating, should have felt like recognition finally, should have felt good. But instead it felt like proof, felt like evidence, felt like confirmation of something Margaret had always suspected, but hadn't wanted to believe. That all those years she'd been a function, not a person. A utility, not a human. Invisible not because people were unkind, but because being invisible was what made her good at her job, what made her seamless, what made her the perfect operator. And she didn't know which hurt more, being invisible for 7 years, or being seen only now when she was disappearing, being recognized only at the moment of ending, being acknowledged as human only when her humanity was about to become irrelevant, obsolete, archived along with the profession itself. Margaret didn't know why she was keeping the list, couldn't quite articulate to herself what purpose it served, what she'd do with it, who would ever read it. But she kept writing, kept documenting, kept making a record of moments that would otherwise disappear completely. Moments that existed only in her memory and the memory of the people involved. Moments that left no official trace, no paper trail, no evidence that could be pointed to and said, see, this happened, this mattered, this was real work, real human work, the kind of work that can't be replicated by machines, no matter how efficient they are. Maybe she was building evidence for some future version of herself who would wonder, who would look back and ask, did any of it matter? Was any of it real? Did I actually help anyone? Or was I just fooling myself? Just making up meaning where there was none? Just pretending my work mattered because I needed it to matter? Needed to believe my life was being spent on something worthwhile? And she could pull out this list and say, look, here, this mattered. This was real. These connections were actual connections that actually helped actual people in actual moments of actual need, not proof that would convince anyone else, not evidence that would change the world's mind about automation or efficiency or progress, but proof for herself, evidence that she could point to when the doubt became too heavy, when the loss became too large, when she needed to remember that 32 years weren't wasted even if they ended, weren't meaningless even if they're obsolete, weren't nothing just because machines can now do the same work faster. The list grew day by day, call by call, moment by moment. May 21st, connected a young man to his mother, heard him say he got the job, heard her cry with relief, tears in her voice, pride and relief all mixed together. And Margaret was there for it, was the third person present for that moment of a mother hearing good news about her son. A son calling to share his success with the person who'd most want to hear it. May 23rd, 3 emergency calls in 1 hour, fires and medical and police. And Margaret was steady, was reliable, was exactly what she needed to be in those moments. Didn't falter, didn't freeze, didn't let the pressure make her slow or uncertain, or anything other than competent, efficient, present. May 25th. A child asked her how to spell operator, asked very seriously, very formally, with the careful pronunciation of someone who is trying very hard to get something right. And Margaret spelled it out, Operator, and the child thanked her very seriously, said thank you in a voice that suggested this information was important, that spelling operator correctly mattered for some reason Margaret would never know, some school assignment or personal project or question that had been bothering this child enough to call the operator and ask. Small things, ordinary things, the daily texture of the work. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make a story someone would tell later, nothing that would show up in a movie or a book, or anything that tries to capture what work is like, what ordinary work is like, what it means to show up day after day and do small things that matter to the people. They matter to even if they don't matter to anyone else, even if they seem insignificant from the outside, even if they're the kind of things machines can do now, can do faster, can do more efficiently. But Margaret was learning to see them differently, was learning to recognize them not as routine, but as sacred, not as ordinary, but as meaningful, not as the boring, repetitive parts of work, but as the actual substance of the work, the actual point, the actual thing that mattered underneath all the metrics and measurements and corporate language about efficiency and productivity. Every connection was someone's real life, someone's actual moment of need, someone's genuine reaching toward another person, and she had been there for it, had made it possible, had been the bridge, had been the witness, had been the presence that turned isolation into connection. And maybe no one recognized that. Maybe no one valued it. Maybe no one even noticed it was happening. But it was happening. It was real. It mattered to the people it mattered to. And that was enough, had to be enough, would be enough if she could just keep remembering it, keep holding it, keep knowing it, even when the world told her it wasn't true, wasn't valuable, wasn't worth what it cost to maintain. Margaret arrived at 6 in the morning on her last day, though her shift didn't start until 8. Arrived early one final time. Wanted the extra time, needed the extra time, couldn't bear to arrive at exactly 8 and have the day begin immediately without space, without breathing room, without a moment to be alone with the ending before the ending officially began. She sat in front of the board in the dark, in the silence before the switchboard powered on, in the space between night and morning, between being an operator and being someone who used to be an operator. And she ran her hands over the cables like reading Braille, like trying to feel something through her fingertips that she couldn't see, couldn't name, couldn't quite hold on to, but needed to try to feel one last time. This topology of connection, this instrument she'd played for 3 decades, this equipment that knew the shape of her hands the way musical instruments know their players, the way tools know the craftsman who's used them for so long that they've worn grooves, made marks, left evidence of the specific way these particular hands held this particular thing. She pressed her palms flat against the board, felt the slight warmth of the machinery underneath, felt it beginning to wake up, and she closed her eyes, tried to memorize this feeling, this moment, this particular quality of being present before work begins, tried to store it somewhere she could access later when this was gone, when the switchboard room was empty, when her hands had forgotten how this felt, and she said goodbye quietly, almost inaudibly, said goodbye to the person she'd been here, the version of herself who existed only in this room doing this work, the Margaret who was a switchboard operator, who knew how to be that, who had an identity built on being that, said goodbye to her because that Margaret was ending today, was becoming past tense, was becoming memory, was becoming someone who existed only in photographs and stories, and the fading memories of people who'd known her when she was still actively this thing she'd been for so long. And then the lights came on fully. The room brightened. Other operators began arriving. The day began despite her wanting to hold it back, despite her wanting more time, despite her needing this transition to go slower, to be gentler, to hurt less than it was hurting. The day began because days don't wait, because endings happen whether you're ready or not, because the world moves forward regardless of whether you've made peace with what you're leaving behind. Her first call that morning came at 8:02, just 2 minutes into her shift, 2 minutes into her last day, and already someone needed connection. Already someone was reaching through the wires, asking to be met, asking for witness, asking for presence. Operator, I need Sacramento, California, please. A man's voice, urgent but polite, needing something, needing to reach someone in Sacramento. And Margaret made her voice especially warm, made her presence especially attentive, made this connection as perfect as she could make it, because this was her last day. And every call mattered, every connection counted, every moment of service deserved her full attention. "Of course," she said. "Of course, one moment, please." Her voice carrying everything she'd learned in 32 years. Carrying patience and efficiency and kindness. And the particular quality of attention that says, "I'm here, I'm present. I'm making this connection for you with the same care I'd want someone to bring to a connection I needed." She made the connection perfectly, cables to jacks to circuits complete, and didn't tell him it was her last day, because why would she? Her job was to be invisible, to be seamless, to be there without being noticed. And she'd been doing that job for 32 years, had perfected the art of being present without being visible, had learned how to matter without making herself matter, how to be essential while staying erased. So she was invisible one last time, did her job the way she'd always done it, with competence and care and zero expectation that anyone would notice or thank her or recognize that this particular connection on this particular day was the last connection she'd ever make, was the end of 32 years of making possible what people needed to be possible. Throughout the morning, Margaret connected call after call after call, each one both ordinary and extraordinary, both routine and unprecedented, both just another call, and also never just another call. Not today. Not when every call was one of the last. Not when the counter was ticking down. Not when she was trying to be present for endings, while also just doing her job, just showing up, just making connections the way she'd made thousands and thousands of connections before. A mother to her son's hospital room. A woman's voice trembling with worry, with fear, with the particular terror that comes with having a child in the hospital and needing to hear their voice. And Margaret connected her immediately, quickly, efficiently, her hands knowing exactly what to do, her voice steady and calm, her presence exactly what this frightened mother needed, even though the mother didn't know Margaret was there, didn't know a human was making this connection, didn't know that someone was holding her fear with gentle, competent hands. A lawyer to a court clerk, professional voices, brisk and efficient, business as usual. And Margaret connected them perfectly, seamlessly, with the kind of invisible competence that characterizes all truly skilled work. The kind of skill that looks easy because it's been practiced so thoroughly it's become automatic, become muscle memory, become something that happens without thought, because thought would only slow it down. A woman to the time and temperature service, routine call, just wanting to know what time it was, simple information, barely worth a human connection, except that the woman sounded elderly, sounded uncertain, sounded like maybe calling the operator was her way of checking in with the world, of confirming that today was happening, that she was still here. And Margaret connected her, and then stayed on after the connection was made, stayed on listening to the recorded voice. The time is 10:47 a.m. The temperature is 68 degrees. Mechanical voice, efficient voice, voice that would never get tired, never need a break, never require a salary or benefits or recognition. And Margaret thought about how this voice had no warmth, but would never get tired, had no presence, but would never make mistakes, had no humanity, but would never need anything, never ask for anything, never require care or attention, or the messy, complicated business of being human in a world that increasingly doesn't want humans, wants functions, wants efficiency, wants perfection, without the cost of maintaining the imperfect beings who used to provide these services. A man trying to reach his wife to say he'd be late, hurried voice, apologetic voice, voice of someone running behind. And Margaret connected him with the same care she brought to emergency calls, the same attention, the same recognition that this mattered because it mattered to him, because someone was waiting, because connection was needed even for small things, especially for small things, always for small things, because small things are most of what life actually is. A child who dialed the operator by accident, small voice, confused voice, hello, not sure what to do. And Margaret said, with infinite gentleness, "It's okay, sweetheart. That's what I'm here for." Said it in a voice that contained 32 years of being there for people who didn't know they needed someone to be there, of answering when someone called even if they didn't quite know why they were calling, of meeting confusion with clarity and fear, with calm and uncertainty, with the steady presence that says you're not alone. I'm here. I've got you. That was enough. Margaret knows now. Sitting in her quiet apartment 3 weeks after the end. 3 weeks after becoming obsolete. 3 weeks into learning who she is when she's not what she was. It was enough because she was there, because she showed up, because she did the work with all the presence she could bring, because she treated every voice with the same gentle attention regardless of whether they were calling with emergencies or simple requests or desperate loneliness or any of the 1,000 ways humans reach toward other humans. Hopping someone will answer. Hopping someone will be there. It was enough. She was enough. The work was enough. Not because it lasted, because it was. And so the work ended for Margaret. And for 11 other operators whose names history won't remember, whose stories won't be told, whose contributions to their city's infrastructure of connection will be forgotten as completely as if they never happened. The work ended, but the person remained changed by 32 years of being necessary, changed by the experience of being made obsolete, changed by the knowledge that what you give your life to can be eliminated in an instant, can be replaced by machines that do it faster and cheaper. and without any of the presence that made it human, made it more than just mechanical connection, made it witnessing, made it care. The person remained, grieving and changed, and free in ways she didn't ask for, didn't want, doesn't quite know what to do with, free from the routine that structured her days, free from the identity that told her who she was, free from the purpose that gave her life shape and meaning, free in the way that losing something essential makes you free, unmoored, untethered, floating in space without gravity, without direction, without the pull that kept you oriented, that told you which way was up. If you're still listening, and most of you won't be, most of you will have drifted away already, will have let the story carry you under the way stories are supposed to carry you, under when they're told in darkness, when they're told gently, when they're told with the rhythm of waves and the patience of someone who knows that presence matters more than plot. If you're still listening, know this: whatever you're letting go of tonight, whatever has let go of you, whatever work you've done that no longer needs doing, whatever identity you've worn that no longer fits, whatever purpose gave your life shape and meaning and structure, and then disappeared, leaving you uncertain and unmoored and unsure of who you are if you're not that thing you were for so long, so many years, so much of your life that you can't remember being anything else, can't imagine being anything else. You mattered, you matter, not because of what you produced, not because of what you accomplished, not because of what you left behind that will last beyond you, not because anyone will remember your name or tell your story or recognize what you contributed, but because you were present, because you showed up, because you did the work, because you cared, because you brought presence to what you did, because you treated people with gentleness, because you met need with care, because you were there when someone needed someone to be there, because you answered when someone called, because you witnessed vulnerability without judgment, because you held crisis without adding to it. You mattered then, you matter now, not because the world says so, not because you're still doing the work that made you necessary, not because you're still producing, still achieving, still contributing in ways the world recognizes and values, but because you exist, because you're here, because you lived through what you lived through, because you survived becoming obsolete, because you carried the weight of being replaced, because you held the grief of ending, because you're still here even though the version of yourself you knew best is gone, archived, made past tense while you remain present tense, breathing, living, trying to figure out what comes next. You're still here. That's enough. That's everything. That's all any of us can do. Stay here. Stay present. Stay breathing. Stay trying. Stay reaching towards something even when we're not sure what we're reaching for. Stay connecting even when connection is harder than it used to be. Stay showing up even when we're not sure what we're showing up for. Stay being here, because being here is the whole work, is the only work, is the work underneath all other work, the fundamental human task of existing, of remaining, of persisting in presence, even when presence is painful, even when presence means feeling the loss, carrying the grief, holding the weight of what's ended and what won't come back, and what we have to learn to live without. Stay here. Keep breathing. That's enough. You're enough. You've always been enough. Not because of what you do, but because of what you are. A human being, a person. Someone who matters not for their function, but for their existence. Not for their productivity, but for their presence. Not for what they can offer the world, but for the simple fact that they're here, they're real, they're alive. They're trying their best in a world that often makes trying your best feel like never quite being enough. Rest now, rest finally. Rest knowing that you did what you could, that you showed up, that you were present, that you mattered, that you still matter, that obsolescence doesn't erase what was real, that endings don't undo what happened, that being replaced doesn't mean you weren't necessary, doesn't mean you weren't important, doesn't mean you didn't contribute something essential in your time, in your way, in the particular shape your life took. Rest knowing that Margaret's story is every story of obsolescence, every story of being replaced, every story of watching your work become unnecessary, your skills become irrelevant, your knowledge become outdated, your purpose become past tense. Rest knowing that if you felt what Margaret felt then, you're not alone in that feeling. You're part of something larger, something that's been happening as long as humans have been working, as long as we've been building our identities around what we do rather than who we are. Rest knowing that the work of being human isn't about lasting forever, isn't about being irreplaceable, isn't about leaving behind monuments or legacies or anything that will survive beyond your own brief time here. The work is just showing up, just being present, just doing what you can with what you have, just treating people with kindness, just meeting need with care, just being there in whatever way you can be there, just offering whatever you can offer, just being the best version of yourself that you can be on any given day, knowing that some days that version will be better than others. But all versions are enough. All attempts count. All presence matters. You've earned this rest. You've earned the permission to stop producing, to stop achieving, to stop proving your worth through what you accomplish, through what you create, through what you leave behind. You've earned the right to just be, just exist, just breathe without justifying the space you take up, the air you consume, the resources you require. You've earned the right to be here without having to constantly demonstrate why you deserve to be here, why you should be allowed to stay, why you're valuable enough to keep around. You're valuable because you exist. That's all. That's everything. That's the only reason you need. You exist, therefore you matter. Therefore you're worthy of care, of rest, of gentleness, of the quiet acknowledgement acknowledgement that being human is hard, and you're doing it. You're managing it, you're surviving it. You're here despite everything that's happened. Despite all the ways the world has told you you're not enough. You're too much, you're obsolete, you're unnecessary, you're replaceable. You're here, you're real, you matter. Good night. Good night, Margaret. Good night to everyone who's ever felt obsolete. Everyone who's ever been replaced. Everyone who's ever wondered if their work mattered. If their life mattered. If they mattered. Good night to the invisible workers. The infrastructure holders. The caregivers. The connectors. The witnesses. The ones who show up and are present and do the work without recognition, without thanks, without validation from a world that doesn't know how to value presence, doesn't know how to measure care. Good night to everyone who's listening, everyone who's already sleeping, everyone who's somewhere in between, everyone who's tried to stay awake but couldn't, everyone who let the story carry them away before the ending, everyone who's drifting now, consciousness fatting, breath slowing, body relaxing into the rest it needs, the rest it deserves, the rest that's been waiting all day, all week, all month, all year, rest that says you can let go now. You can stop holding on. You can release the day. You can trust that tomorrow will come whether you worry about it or not. You can sleep knowing that sleeping is not giving up, not failing, not weakness, but strength, renewal, the necessary pause that makes continuing possible. Good night, sleep now, rest deeply. You've earned it, you matter. You've always mattered, you'll always matter. Not because of what you do, because you are. Good night.